We know that this venue is a little smaller than most of our rumbles. Our rumble on the River Community Forums go from town to town, neighborhood to neighborhood, and church to church, and synagogue to synagogue, and temple to temple, and mosque to mosque. So we have different sized venues, but this is our smallest. We love this venue, and we very much thank the Multnomah Friends community for sharing with us this evening. Laura, would you do land acknowledgement?
This is the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board land acknowledgement, so we read it before every meeting. This is a public meeting, so you can attend online or in person, and I think people might want to know that. So this is what we read before the Oregon Hanford cleanup meetings. We respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, activism, and learning take place on lands we inhabit throughout Oregon and Washington, cared for by Indigenous peoples since time began. This meeting, by the way, is taking place on Clackamas Chinook land, where we are this evening. The Hanford nuclear weapons site encompasses culturally significant lands belonging to the Wanapum, the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Nez Perce Tribe, and the Spokane Indian Reservation. We acknowledge the economic and social values, including systemic racism, classism, and the disregard for Indigenous, Black, and immigrant communities that made harm to this place possible. The interconnectedness of the people, the land, and the natural environment cannot be overstated. The health of one is necessary for the health of all. We recognize the pre-existing and continued sovereignty of these tribes. We thank them for continuing to share their traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom with us, and for their willingness to work with us on how we might care for one another and the land. We commit to working towards cleanup and restoration of the Hanford site that is based on future tribal use and stewardship of these lands and these waters.
I'll be gone really soon. Thank you, Laura. Anyway, welcome to Rumble number 12. We're really, really happy to have you here. And if we could get this, look at that. We have like 40 co-sponsors. These are organizations that help with our outreach and table, and they were very understanding tonight because the tabling situation is pretty crowded. We're going to have humans in the room as well as tables, so we'll put up with it. So if you didn't get a program, all of our panelist bios and quotes related to this evening's discussion is in your program. And on the back of your program is a handy-dandy contact and elected officials sheet for your refrigerator or home bulletin board, so you can keep telling those people they're working for us, respectfully of course, but they're working for us and they're working for our lands and waters. So tonight's panel, we'll be starting off with Floyd Barbette, the Executive Director for the Oregon Conservancy Foundation. We'll be having David Schuschel, who will be zoomed in from Massachusetts this evening, and David is the Director of Resource Policy and Resource Planning Analysis for IEFA, and IEFA stands for Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. And then we'll be having Kelly Campbell from Columbia Riverkeeper, the Policy Director there, and then we'll have Brenna Fossen from PCHERP, Portland Community for Human Rights for the Philippines. She's their education officer. And then we'll be having Dan Sears from Columbia Riverkeeper, Advocacy Director. So we're going to start with that right now.
My presentation is an abbreviated history of Oregon's failed Trojan nuclear power plant. It references the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island with an overview of energy regulatory laws in both Oregon and Washington state. And it provides a history of how NuScale's proposed small modular nuclear reactor came to Oregon and how SMNRs are coming to Hanford that are not clean energy nor the answer to mitigating catastrophic climate change. Next slide. I provide an overview of Trojan's untold story. In 1975, it started out with a 40-year operating license out to 2015. It began operation. Over time, it suffers unidentified corrosion problems in its 4 steam generators, leaking radiation, and repeatedly having to shut Trojan down for repairs. In 1993, Portland General Electric threw in the towel. It closed Trojan permanently and sued Westinghouse, even though the steam generators only had a 30-day warranty. PGE then filled each of the steam generators with concrete, barged them upriver, burying them at Hanford, where they also put the reactor vessel, and later entered into a court settlement sealing court records, including the corrosion evidence, not available to the public. Ratepayers in the end pay for it all. The next slide. The next slide is a schematic of the Trojan nuclear pressurized water reactor. And I really want to focus on the containment structure, which is to the left of the slide. It had 3 independent cooling systems, but the most important one was number 1, which is in red. This cooling system circulated water under pressure, so the water could not flash to steam. And under pressure, if there was a pipe break, that water would then be forced out. So it was important to keep the water in the reactor vessel to prevent the worst of accidents, which is a meltdown. Now you will note that underneath the reactor containment building was a screened emergency core cooling system recirculation sump pit. It was supposed to have a fine mesh screen over the top. It had pumps inside of it. If in the event there was a water cascading into this, it would pump that water back up into the reactor vessel. Trojan was promoted as absolutely safe, affordable, generating source of electricity. Throughout its operation, high-level radioactive waste was to be taken away and buried in a deep geologic repository. Next slide. In 1977, 2 years into Trojan's operation, the control room building walls were discovered to be missing reinforced rods, which do not comply with the Uniform Building Code. Pre-Scouty and Associates, an independent engineering firm, concluded that, quote, considering the magnitude of earthquake loads and the importance of the structure, it was the grossest kind of error. PGE sued Bechtel Corporation. In 1981, Bechtel and PGE entered into another undisclosed settlement. The court records were sealed to prevent any public disclosure. Next slide. Every year, Trojan was inspected by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Oregon Department of Energy, and Portland General Electric. Yet in 1989, construction debris was discovered in Trojan's recirculation sump pit. Again, that pit at the bottom of the reactor containment structure. Mesh screens over the pit were never installed. Debris larger than a dime would have destroyed the emergency core cooling system pumps. It operated that way for 14 years. If turned on, the NRC fined Portland General Electric $280,000, even though in 1988, PG paid out more than $90 million in stock dividends. The NRC fine was chump change for Portland General Electric. Next slide. As I said before, in 1993, PGE permanently shuts Trojan down, with 790 spent fuel assemblies stored in the spent fuel pool. all of the spent fuel that had been created at Trojan from the beginning of its operation because it had no place to go. 10 years later, in 2003, we're now into 28 years after the beginning of Trojan, Trojan's spent fuel is put into 34 dry casks, which are shown at the bottom of the screen. And these are on site at the Trojan plant still in an independent spent fuel storage installation. In 2024, where we are today, 49 years after Trojan operated, a permanent federally licensed high-level radioactive waste repository still doesn't exist in the United States. In 2019, PG asked the NRC for another 40 years to store this waste. They granted that license, and now the waste can remain on site out to 2025. That'll be 84 years after the Trojan plant first operated. None of that was supposed to happen. Next slide. Trojan's untold impacts. In 2000, Joseph J. Magano of the Radiation and Public Health Project published a health study documenting infant mortality rates around Trojan and 4 other nuclear plants in the United States, both during their operation and after all 5 nuclear plants closed down. Upon closure, infant deaths decreased in all 5 nuclear plant locations. Next slide. And of course, we have the accident on March 28th in 1979. The 3 Mile Island accident occurs near Middletown, Pennsylvania. The reactor meltdown and the lack of repository for high-level repository for nuclear waste in the country raises public concern over risks of operating nuclear plants in the United States. Next slide. In 1980, Oregon voters adopted a statutory ballot measure law. One of the authors of that, Chuck Johnson, is in the audience. You should talk with him. Before a commercial nuclear plant can be built in Oregon, there must be a permanently federally licensed repository for terminal disposition of its high-level nuclear waste. If such a repository exists, then a proposed nuclear plant must be put to a statewide vote of the people. 44 years later, no nuclear power plants have been built in Oregon. Next slide. Thanks to Chuck and Peter Burgell. NuScale comes to town. NuScale, small modular nuclear reactor design, was developed and patented by Oregon State University. In 2007, NuScale incorporates in Oregon. It acquires Oregon State University's patents in exchange for OSU having a small equity interest in NuScale. NuScale a Fluor Corporation, by the way, buys a majority interest in NuScale in 2011. Together, they pursued NRC approval of their nuclear reactor design, even though it still has unresolved safety issues with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And it proposed construction of its first SM&R facility at the Idaho National Laboratory. Due to cost overruns, this project is abandoned at the end of 2023. NuScale still seeks to build its SM&Rs worldwide, and Brenna Fossen will be addressing this further in her presentation. Keep in mind that NuScale's design is unproven and cost projections keep rising. Next slide. This is a schematic of NuScale's design module. It's a self-contained nuclear reactor with a generator, steam generator. It's all inside the module like a battery. One plant facility can be configured with up to 12 modules producing 924 megawatts. One module below, as you see underneath that text, is equal to 77 megawatts, and that little dot up above it is a human. And if you look at the right side of the screen, you'll note that the size of that module is equal to one of Trojan's steam generators. NuScale's module produces the same high-level nuclear waste as Trojan did, and would need to store its waste on site since there's no permanent high-level radioactive waste repository in this country. Next slide. One thing NewScale is good at is increasing attempts to amend or repeal Oregon's 1980 ballot measure law. From 2015 up to 2023, there's been bills sponsored in the Oregon legislature. And now they're setting a record in 2023. 4 bills were sponsored. It makes it more difficult to follow these bills and oppose them the more there are. And we don't know what's going to happen in 2025. That they do it in every other full legislative session. They could try a short session this year, but we don't know. Next slide. In 2021, a new Oregon law incentivizes nuclear power. HB 2021 sets clean energy targets. It defines non-emitting electricity solely as generated electricity that doesn't emit greenhouse gas. It seeks to eliminate only generated greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. Now that's a good thing. It's good that we're doing that. But the bad thing is it narrows the definition magically and turns nuclear power into clean energy, competing for funding with renewable energy that's clean, economical, and available now. Next slide. And of course, NewScale will be back with its clean energy. In fact, they will use HB 2021 either for an exemption or a repeal, more likely a repeal, because that's the direction they're going in now of the 1980 ballot measure. Next slide. Let's take a look at the unclean nuclear fuel cycle. This is what we're going to get. It starts with uranium mining. It goes to milling, processing, enrichment, fuel fabrication. And the fuel fabrication, of course, is delivered to the construction of the nuclear plant. The nuclear plant then produces the nuclear waste. Except for power production, CO2 emissions are created throughout the nuclear fuel cycle. It also creates nuclear waste, the need to transport radioactive materials, unforeseen nuclear accidents, in-life decommissioning, radioactive contamination, and nuclear weapons proliferation risks, especially for the high-temperature, small modular nuclear reactor advanced nuclear designs that increase uranium-235 enrichment close to weapons-grade material. Next slide. Washington State also does the same thing. It provides the same kind of definition in the 2019 bill. Non-emitting electricity generation is defined solely as electricity from generating facility not emitting greenhouse gases. Nuclear power becomes clean, and Washington doesn't have Oregon's 1980 ballot measure law, making them more vulnerable to the nuclear lobby. Already, a large number of nuclear bills are sponsored in the Washington legislature to get more taxpayer subsidies right now. The lost opportunity costs for renewable energy investments are growing. I am confident that David Schlissel will be addressing this. Next slide. Meanwhile, X-Energies at Hanford. On July 23rd, Energy Northwest and X-Energy signed a joint development agreement for an XE100 advanced small modular nuclear project. The project proposes to have up to 12 XE100 helium-cooled pebble bed nuclear reactor modules, 960 megawatts in total. Again, very close to Trojan. The XE100 uses a new enriched up to 20% HALEU fuel. XE100 has no operating history and actual costs are unknown. The U.S. Department of Energy is also planning more nuclear at Hanford in a land for clean energy leasing program called Clean Up to Clean Energy. And at Hanford, they're proposing to put aside 19,000 acres for small modular nuclear reactors, solar battery storage, and other renewable alternatives. Of course, SMRs are not renewable. And you will note that they also have 2 other locations, which only they're going to provide for with solar. All of them have nuclear on it, but Hanford is getting the nuclear. For all the subsidies that SMRs cannot make a significant reduction in global warming gases by 2040 or 45. We need to change the way we live and rely heavily on energy conservation, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. Dan Series and Kelly Campbell will be further addressing the Hanford issues in their presentation. And finally, I think that Michael Marriott in 2014 nailed it. To call nuclear power clean is an affront to science and to common sense. I couldn't have said it better. Finally, I want to point out that on this table over here, we have info providing a fact sheet on NewScale, an overview on OCF, and a resource guide showing live links to a large body of good reference to material. To obtain a PDF with working live links, call or email us, and we will email it to you so that you can then use those links. Also sign OCF's contact list so you can be notified of future nuclear legislation. I thank everyone for the opportunity to give this presentation. It's been a rush.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Schlissel. I've been looking at nuclear issues for roughly 50 years and 2 weeks.
Roughly, huh?
No, I started the first week in January of 1974. Now, what is a small modular reactor? Generally defined as reactors that are 300 megawatts electric or smaller. It's roughly a quarter the size of the new large reactors that are being built in the US. And now the small and small modular reactors doesn't mean they're going to be small. It's meant to make people believe that they're less threatening because, hey, it's small. The NewScale reactor from your home state, each module is 77 megawatts, but can be grouped up to 12 modules, which is 924 megawatts, which is not necessarily small. Another design by GE and Hitachi is a single 300 megawatt unit, but you can group them in 4 or 8. The modular refers to the fact that the plants would be fabricated in factories, the parts, and then assembled at site. The designs include scaled-down versions of existing boiling and pressurized water reactors, as well as other proposals for technologies that either have been tried and failed or have never been tried at all. Roughly 80 SMR designs are being proposed around the world. I'm going to focus on the first half of my slides, my conclusions, because time is limited. If you're interested, you can get the slides and look at what I didn't cover. My contact information is at the end, the last slide. I'm happy to answer any questions. I won't be staying around for the question and answer period. It's late here in Boston and I've got a cold. Here are my key SMR risks. The U.S. nuclear industry has a decades-long history of being unable to meet estimated costs and schedules. It's been called over-promising and under-delivering. There have been hundreds of billions of dollars, excuse me, in cost overruns and years-long scheduled delays. None of the SMR designs currently being marketed in the U.S. and around the world have been built. None have even been licensed in the US or in Canada. As I mentioned before, some proposals have exotic designs that have never been tried or that have failed in the past. One of the projects is called TerraPower. We fondly refer to it as the Bill Gates reactor. It uses a design that has failed in the past, and they refuse to tell the public. They claim they've resolved the design issues, but when they go to talk to the NRC about them, about their design upgrades, they shut out the public. SMRs are not good tools for fighting climate change, despite all of the claims that you will hear. They're too expensive to build and they take too long to build. From the beginning of design of a reactor through when it goes into service can be as long as 10, 15 years. Alternatives such as renewables, wind, solar, battery storage, energy efficiency can be put online, are less expensive and can be put into service in a much less time, 3-4 years at most. I would expect you're aware, the first NuScale SMR that was going to be built for communities in Utah, and I think in Idaho, there was at least one in New Mexico, one in Nevada, maybe even one in California. That was canceled because communities were frightened to sign contracts to buy the power from the SMR because it required them, let me step back, NuScale and UAMPS, the Utah Associated Municipal Power System, promised, had a target price for power from the SMR, but it was only a target. When you looked at the power purchase agreement, anyone who signed it, any community, would have to pay the actual price. So the target was right before the SMR was canceled in November. The target price was $89 per megawatt hour, but there was no guarantee that the actual price was going to be anywhere close to that. And that should be a warning sign for any government, utility, ratepayers, or private investors about the risks associated with SMRs. A key warning sign is that NuScale had to tell, the estimated cost of the NuScale SMR became public because they had to tell all of these small communities, mainly in Utah, what the cost was. And each of those utilities had to tell the members of their community what was happening with the cost. So the projected cost became public. The other SMR vendors and potential buyers are refusing to make the estimated cost public. These are 4 examples of vendors. The reason for that is they've learned from the experience in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, first decades of this century, that when ratepayers and some management of utilities learn the actual costs, what the actual costs are likely to be, or how high they could be, they'll drop out, they'll refuse to participate in the project. There was something back in the 20th century called rate shock, which meant that when the proposed nuclear plants were finished and went into service, they were far more expensive than had been claimed at the beginning. And the last key point is there will be increasing competition for SMRs from truly declining cost renewable sources and battery storage. How expensive can the power from SMRs get? The heads of two companies, one Constellation Energy Corporation, which owns the most nuclear plants in the U.S. now, sees a price of $150 to $160 per megawatt hour for the power from a new SMR, and it wants no piece of one without a guaranteed contract that someone will pay that much. The original claim was that atomic power would be too cheap to meter. But as you look at their history, far from being too cheap to meter, they became too expensive to build. I'm not going to go through all of the history. I have a longer presentation that I can send anyone if you're interested in it. Just email me. That talks about the history of nuclear costs. This slide focuses on 6 recent power plants built in the U.S. and in Europe. You can see that the current estimates of the plants are far higher than what was estimated at the start of construction. Flamanville in France is currently expected to be 4 times as expensive as when it was first construction began. And new reactors that have recently been completed, canceled, or under construction have taken far longer to build than the vendors or the utility claimed. On the left part, you can see a new scale estimated that it would take 4 years or less to get their SMR online to get start and finish nuclear construction. Just about every other plant listed here had similar optimistic assumptions. One way to say is optimistic. The assumptions were optimistic. I'm also comfortable with saying misleading estimates. And you can see that some of them have taken 15 years or longer. The average is even in just under 10 years. And this is just the nuclear construction. This is the construction that began, the time between when they got a permit from the NRC or whatever regulatory authority in the country and connected to the grid. So if you're being told that the reactor will be in service by 2030, 2033, don't believe it. It's not been the experience of the industry. This shows the estimated increase in cost of the new scale reactor at 4 different times, and the cost per kilowatt, not accounting for inflation, the cost more than doubled. This is what I mentioned before about cost. As the construction cost went up, the estimated cost of power from the new scale reactor also went up. Now this is one of my favorite charts. One of the claims of SMR promoters is that they will be cheaper to build than existing reactors. This chart compares the last estimated cost of the new scale, it was called the carbon-free power plant. In Utah, it was $20,000 per kilowatt, or $20 million per megawatt, which was slightly more expensive than the Vogtle nuclear plants that are just being completed in Georgia, which are among the most expensive in the world. And the new scale CFPP was not scheduled to start construction until 2026 and be completed until the end of 2030. So there was plenty of time for the cost to continue to go up. I mentioned this before, concern over rising construction costs and rising power prices were the reason why the new scale SMR was canceled. No one could be guaranteed how high the ultimate cost of the project might be. In talking to media or giving other presentations, I liken it to, you go into a car dealer and the car dealer says, I have the perfect car for you, will you sign a contract for it? I do need to tell you, it won't be ready until 2035. I don't know what it will cost. And it actually hasn't been designed or built yet. Now, your response would probably be goodbye or WTF or something like that. But that's exactly what they're asking utilities to do, and that's what utilities and public utility districts are going to ask their customers to do. It's to sign a contract now or in the near future for a product that won't be finished for probably a decade, and that no one will know or guarantee what the ultimate cost of that product will be. I mentioned this before, SMRs are not good tools for fighting climate change, take too long to build, there are faster and cheaper options. Units on the coast will be threatened by ocean level rise and severe storms. Inland units will be threatened by storms and more severe droughts from global warming. Ultimately, rather than being complementary to renewables, which is what the nuclear industry and utilities claim, SMRs will compete with renewables for space on transmission lines. This is a chart we did right before the new scale SMR was canceled in November. You can see at that time the cost, not including the subsidies and the Inflation Reduction Act, was $119 a megawatt hour. If you include the $30 IRA subsidy that each of those of you in the room and everybody in my house here would pay in our taxes, with that the cost to customers would go down to $89 a megawatt hour, according to them. It was far higher than offshore wind, projected offshore wind, solar, and battery storage, land-based wind, and just plain solar PV costs. What about the estimated costs of other SMRs? You have to ask, why don't they want to tell you what's their current project cost and schedule estimate? The reason is you'd run away, given the uncertainty of the industry. What's going on with the Bill Gates reactor? They refused to provide any data available to the public on cost and schedule. The utility, I guess they also sell in Oregon. Pacific Core is doing an integrated resource plan in Wyoming that includes what they, not a detailed cost estimate for the Bill Gates reactor, but it's using proxy values that do not reflect the finalized costs. That's their term. But they refuse to even reveal what those proxy values are. Now, Bill Gates has said that his reactor will be online by 2030. A recent report for large industrial users of electricity in Norway by a consulting firm expresses doubt that the reactor will be in service by 2040 or after 2030. I'm going to skip this one. This is how you can contact me. You can email me, and I'd be happy to answer your questions, send you information, other information, and you can go to the IEFA website and go to a landing page on SMR and see what we've been writing about this for the last 2+ years. And I guess that's it. If enough people have questions, we could, at some future time, set up a Zoom call. And I'd be happy to do that and answer people's questions.
Thank you.
Take care, have a good
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Kelly Campbell. I'm the policy director at Columbia Riverkeeper. Is that better? Use she, her pronouns. So one of the projects that I work on at Columbia Riverkeeper is preventing small modular nuclear reactors from being built along the Columbia River, particularly at Hanford is the place where they talk about building them. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the details of small modulars because thanks to Lloyd and David, you just got a lot of information there. So I think everyone's probably on the same page now that small modular nuclear reactors are not the way to go. What I've been asked to talk about tonight is kind of going back in my history as an anti-war activist and talk more about the connections between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. So that's what I'm going to focus on here tonight. The short version is, if you go to the next slide. Oh, I have it. Oh, I have it.
The power.
Wow, do I though?
No, you don't. You brought up something.
What do I gotta do?
Oh, there you go.
The short version is nuclear weapons and nuclear power inextricably linked.
Ella, can you stand?
I can.
I take the mic, I might take her
Okay. Can we do this?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, next slide. Okay. So, basically, whether you're talking about nuclear power or nuclear weapons, there's injustice throughout the nuclear life cycle. There's just nothing clean about it. And Lloyd kind of went through a lot of this, but I just want to focus for a minute on the beginning. The uranium mining. Uranium mining around the world is almost all done on indigenous lands. It's decimating lands. It's decimating the people that work in the mines, the people who live in those communities. From the very beginning, there's nothing clean about nuclear. It's coming from these kinds of effects on indigenous communities. So all the way through with the milling, enrichment, production, use, storage, it's the same. It's very similar processes. It's not different. The only difference is when you make a nuclear weapon at the end rather than a nuclear power plant. And then finally, the nuclear waste disposal. Disposal is sort of an optimistic word because we don't have a way to dispose of nuclear waste. So if you're a community that has a nuclear power plant built in it or nuclear weapons being produced, you're going to be living with that nuclear waste for literally generations. We have no answer for it. So there's just no way that this is considered part of a green energy or clean energy solution in terms of nuclear power. There's nothing clean about it. Another connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear power are nuclear power plants and the risks of nuclear war. This is a picture of the Zaporizhzhia plant in Ukraine, which everyone probably knows, the Russia took over. When that was built, I'm sure no one thought there was any way that a foreign power was going to come in and use a nuclear power plant against them. So anytime you're building a nuclear power plant, there's a risk of it being used as a weapon of war. There's more risks of nuclear proliferation as nuclear power plants are built in different countries and around the world. That technology that's being used, again, it's very similar between nuclear weapons and nuclear power. So if you have a power plant, much easier to start creating nuclear weapons. Risks of sabotage, non-state actors going after nuclear power plants. The depleted uranium that is produced as a waste product from enriching uranium, that's used in war. The US used that in Iraq, used that in Afghanistan. There's actually an old report I was trying to find today that Hibakusha, A-bomb survivors from Japan did years ago during the Iraq War about the children of Iraq as victims of nuclear war because of the depleted uranium that was impacting the children's health there. So I do want to point out, when we start talking about proliferation and sabotage, the United States is the first and only country to actually use nuclear weapons against another population in war. And so I think, here, before we start pointing fingers at other people, we need to actually work in our own country to make sure that we are not part of the problem, because we have been, the crux of the problem. Another way to look at nuclear weapons and nuclear war being linked is through this just transition framework. Raise your hand if you've seen this before. I love this. So if you Google movement generation, just transition, you'll come up, they have a whole zine, it's in different languages, and then they have this framework. So if you look on the left there, we're basically living in the extractive economy framework, right? And so we're, resources, we're extracting them. It's dig, burn, dump. That's fossil fuels, that's also nuclear power. And you also see at the bottom of that extractive economy, there's a tank there, that represents militarism. So the quote that I love from this scene is that we don't live in a democracy with the problem of militarism. Rather, militarism is the defining feature of a governance in an extractive economy. So the ultimate in militarism is a nuclear weapon, right? So we are using our nuclear weapons in order to be able to live in this extractive economy. And really, where we need to be moving over to the right side, this living economy that's based on regeneration, ecological and social well-being, deep democracy, cooperation, caring and sacredness, that's where we're going, and there's no place for nuclear in that world. Gender and nuclear, this could be a whole week-long seminar, so I'm just going to touch on a couple different issues here. Women and children, their bodies are more at risk from nuclear radiation. We don't even actually know why, because we don't fund the studies to find that out. Our studies historically have focused on reference man, who's a 30-year-old white, healthy man, and that's how we tested things. So there's actually, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility has a really good fact sheet on their website that goes into this more. Ray Atchison, who is with Reaching Critical Will and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, does a ton of work around nuclear policy. We're talking about how nuclear weapons are gendered, that they're about power, violence, and security, and their abolition is challenged by the stark lack of gender diversity in discussions and negotiations related to nuclear policy. In fact, there's a bunch of groups inside the Beltway and on the East Coast that work on nuclear policy issues that literally in the past 5 years have developed a pledge that they won't sit on panels talking about nuclear power where there isn't at least one woman on the panel. Because there's literally multiple panels all the time that are just men talking about nuclear policy. Let's see, polls consistently show men are more supportive of nuclear power than women. So I guess my thought is calling for a feminist foreign policy. There's a lot of work going on right now talking about what does a feminist foreign policy look like. I would say also a feminist domestic policy. And again, going back to the slide before, I think that looks like this living economy side that's based on caring and cooperation. Let's see. Is clean up to clean energy the new Atoms for Peace? Atoms for Peace in the 50s was propaganda. Sounds great, doesn't it? I mean, who doesn't like peace? Justifying continued nuclear weapons production by linking it to peaceful nuclear power and what that was going to do for us. Now, and Dan will talk a little bit more about this, I think, at Hanford and these other sites, and Lloyd touched on this as well, there's this new clean up to clean energy. Who doesn't love clean up to clean energy, right? However, it's, this is a project that would allow more nuclear siting at Hanford, which is already the most contaminated nuclear site in the Western Hemisphere. We don't need to be creating more nuclear waste at Hanford. So, nice slogans, not really what it means. Hanford, and Dan will talk about this a lot more, but Hanford is a place that matters. It's really not a sacrifice zone. It is the place where the U.S. produced the plutonium for the bombing of Nagasaki, and it is, now it is the Western Hemisphere's largest cleanup site. So in terms of Hanford, I would just say, we need to focus on cleanup, not putting more more nuclear waste at Hanford, which is what would happen if we did build SMNRs out at Hanford under the Clean Up to Clean Energy plan, or this other plan that Energy Northwest has going with X Energy to build an SMNR out there. The B Reactor Museum, horrible propaganda machine if you go out to Hanford. It's actually closed for a couple years, which is probably good, but again, the story needs to change, right? We need to be telling multiple stories of who's impacted by what was produced at B Reactor and how that's impacted the world. And finally, following the leadership of tribal communities. Hanford is a really special place for tribal communities in our region, and they have a lot of knowledge and a lot to say about what happens there, and I think our role is really to follow their lead. Oops. Last slide, taking action. Lots of good tables. Columbia River Keeper has a table. We've got a petition opposing small modular reactors at Hanford. Please sign the petition. We've got some lovely postcards that are around the issue of Fukushima and the water being released into the Pacific Ocean. Please sign a postcard. Yuki's holding them up in the back, and leave it at the table. We're going to go try to visit the Japanese Consul General office here in Portland and deliver those postcards. And there's so many great organizations here tonight, so please, if you're not already involved, get involved with one or more of these organizations. Picture on the right, you've probably all seen. I took that picture at Sunnyside Environmental School, where my son used to go. And I was just at his high school the other night for a PTA meeting. And it's, wow, we need to raise $25,000 to get the stuff that our teachers and our kids need. We could get that money pretty easily if we stop subsidizing nuclear power, if we stop building nuclear weapons. It's about changing that whole paradigm. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Officer at the Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, or PCHR.
Yeah.
So PCHR has been around since 2005. We are a grassroots organization in solidarity with the Filipino people's struggle for national liberation, national sovereignty, and genuine democracy. I want to thank Bonnie and all the other organizers of this event tonight, and my fellow panelists for teaching us all about the dangers of nuclear power, nuclear energy, and talking about our own local villain, NuScale Power Corporation. Yeah, boo's right. So tonight I see my task really as connecting the local conditions that our panelists laid out to international ones, because in 2024 we know that the economy, politics, and militaries are global. So to set the scene, in May 2023, less than a year ago, current Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the late dictator Marcos, he visited Washington, D.C., and while he was there, he had a meeting at the White House with a relatively unknown nuclear power company, NuScale Power Corporation. So after doing some initial research, we soon learned that NuScale had plans to survey several sites in the Philippines for their SMRs. And this incidentally was backed by the Filipino billionaire Enrique Rason Jr., who is a shipping and port magnate, and incidentally is the person who is currently suing ILWU Local 8 here in Portland into bankruptcy. So, as a former colony and current neo-colony of the U.S., the Philippines is unsurprisingly a very resource-rich country. But the vast majority of the Filipino people do not benefit from these resources. Rather, profits are reserved for the big landlord and big business class, like the Marcoses and the Dutertes. And of course, the U.S. banks and corporations. It is also in a very strategic position geographically. If you don't know where it is, take your phone out, look it up after I'm finished. You'll see what I mean. It's near China and borders the West Philippine Sea, which is part of what's known as the South China Sea. And in the last decade, the U.S. has ramped up its military presence there and now has 9 de facto military bases across the archipelago. This past November, in November 2023, the Philippines signed what's called a 1-2-3 nuclear agreement with the U.S. This agreement would make it possible for the U.S. to transfer nuclear material to the Philippines for peaceful purposes. But baked into this agreement and all of the other 23 1-2-3 nuclear agreements that the U.S. has with 23 other countries is the condition that says the host country, the Philippines in this case, needs to provide physical security up to and including armed guards, collaborating with local police, military, to protect all the nuclear material that the U.S. would import and all of the sites that would host this nuclear material. This will bring even more problems for the Filipino people, who are just struggling to get by in their own cost of living crisis. Under the corrupt administration of Marcos Jr. and his predecessors, the Philippines has remained the #1 deadliest country for land defenders in all of Asia for almost the last decade. We know also that the armed forces of the Philippines operates essentially as a mercenary force for the rich and powerful. A UN report found in 2020 that extrajudicial killings of journalists, trade unionists, human rights defenders, and civilians occur in the Philippines with near impunity. So the question really that we've been asking here, and the question that people and organizations in the Philippines have been asking, and the question that I pose to all of you tonight is why? Why is the U.S., through NewScale and other similar companies, making these deals with the corrupt government of the Philippines to export this untested, risky, expensive technology that is too expensive even for U.S. consumers?
That's right.
To the Philippines in their own crisis, energy crisis.
Right.
NewScale is a company, as we've heard, that has not been able to deliver on even one project, is clearly not fit to be providing energy to a place halfway around the world. The Philippines is also a country without any nuclear infrastructure. AGHAM, which is a national organization of Filipino scientists and engineers, recently released a statement documenting their concerns about the 1-2-3 nuclear agreement and the proposed nuclear reactor sites. One of their main objections is that as of the end of 2023, the Philippines has no nuclear safety or environmental impact experts. There's no infrastructure. Overall, the manufacturing sector in the Philippines is at the lowest level it's ever been since 1949. It is largely an agricultural country. So what this is creating are conditions in which the Philippines will be more and more dependent on the U.S. for this infrastructure, for the expertise, and likely for security. We know that the import of nuclear technology under the proposed 123 U.S.-Philippines nuclear agreement requires increased security for all of this nuclear material. And we also have seen for decades that where there is increased military and security, there are increased human rights violations.
That's right.
And environmental destruction. The U.S. already has sent the Philippine government over $1 billion since 2015 in military aid from our tax money here, and has expanded its military presence explicitly as part of its encirclement of China. It's not shy about admitting that. So what we see exemplified in NuScale is the investment of the U.S. and Philippine governments in expensive nuclear technology that risks environmental devastation and increased human rights violations, all to generate more profit and military power, none of which 99% of Filipino people will ever benefit from. None of which 99% of us in this room will ever benefit from.
That's right.
So here in Portland, PCHERP and other organizations are heeding the calls coming from fellow land defenders and scientists in the Philippines to get NuScale out and to halt the 123 U.S.-Philippines nuclear agreement. We are currently forming a coalition with these tangible demands. So if you care about the environment, human rights, nuclear disarmament, where your tax dollars are going, I encourage you to find PCHERP's table at the back where Copeland is raising or find me afterwards so you can join this work and the work of PCHERP more broadly. My mom was born in Richland, Washington, which is very close to the Hanford nuclear site. Her father worked at the nuclear power plant and as a child got her thyroid removed. And the scar across her neck remains to this day. So I'm here to tell you that the local is global.
That's right.
And our fight here is in solidarity with the fight of the Filipino people against foreign domination. Thank you. Sorry, I forgot about this. Thank you. So our calls to action, please sign on to our open letter at this QR code or at our table over there. And like I mentioned, please join the local No to NuScale campaign that I mentioned. We need to get NuScale out of the Philippines, out of Oregon.
Shut them down.
That's right. Shut NuScale down.
Hi everybody, I'm Dan Sears. I'm the Advocacy Director for Columbia River Keeper. And I'm going to end the panel of speakers just by putting a highlight on the Hanford nuclear site and the role it plays in potential new nuclear development in the Northwest. This is a picture of people in a boat in the Hanford Reach. The Hanford Reach is a 50-mile free-flowing stretch of the Columbia River that flows through the most contaminated place in the Western Hemisphere. A place so contaminated that the people who have lived there since time immemorial can no longer use it. It's accessible by boat, and in this boat we see people from state agency, leaders from Yakima Nation's cleanup program, and some staff from Columbia River Keeper, along with a fishing guide. out there looking at this stretch of river. In some years, 25% of the fall Chinook run spawns right above Hanford. So this is no wasteland. It is vital to the people who have depended on the Columbia River for time immemorial.
Could you talk a little louder?
Yes, I can talk a little louder. Thank you. So Hanford is located on tribal lands. As was mentioned earlier, the Hanford site is sacred and very important to the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation, Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Nez Perce Tribe, and the Lenape. You can see the Yakima Nation Reservation in dark purple, the lands they ceded in lighter purple, and the Columbia Basin in the darker tan. So forever, people have been gathering, hunting, and fishing at Hanford, and when you go to the landscape and see what it looks like, you understand why. It's incredibly productive, free-flowing water, cliffs and bluffs with extraordinary wildlife, even to this day, despite the contamination that's there. Every couple of years, the cleanup program for Yakima Nation, we get to work with them on an event that brings young people to Hanford from Yakima Nation, and other people as well from around the region. This event was held in 2022, just upstream from Hanford, and you can see the gathering of canopies at a place called Vernita, just right upstream from the Hanford nuclear site, where there's a bridge. And this youngster throwing a rock into the Hanford Reach, upstream from Hanford, notably. The reason why it's so important for people to come back and to connect with this place is that this is going to be a multi-generational effort to understand the waste that has been dumped into the Hanford nuclear site, much less clean it up. And that work is being led more and more by the people from Yakima Nation and other tribes who are the experts in all these layers of information that people have to grapple with to understand the problems at Hanford nuclear waste. And so what I want to really leave you with tonight, if I'm going to just summarize what I'm going to say, one, Hanford is incredibly contaminated. The problem is not solved. The people of the Columbia River, tribal people of the Columbia River, have a right to use this place reserved in treaties. It is the legally binding agreement by my government, the U.S. government. And they have broken this promise by poisoning the land through nuclear development. The idea of compounding this problem with additional nuclear experimentation is immoral, irrational, and it defies explanation at this time, given what we've already heard about small modular nuclear reactors. Hanford is a really difficult topic to enter into. I grew up in the Northwest, a family who worked in Hanford, and yet I learned very little about it growing up in school. It's steeped in technical language, in scary realities like there is contamination reaching the Columbia River today at levels that exceed regulatory standards. That poison is in the water, in the river, in the groundwater, and it was put there decades ago. So whatever we do today will have a very long, long half-life, literally. So thinking about these things and the confusing public processes that govern how we'll manage these big problems, it can be really difficult for people to learn about Hanford and to engage. But people are coming to do that more and more. And I want to acknowledge that there are people in this room who are far more expert than I am about the history of Hanford and grappling with these problems, people who have suffered their own health consequences as downwinders or downriver people, and people who've built connections that I have relied upon, that I have learned from. And I would say first and foremost that most of what I know about Hanford comes from the experts from the Yakima Nation and their environmental restoration and waste management program. They've been extraordinary leaders in the effort to clean up Hanford. This is a map you often see when describing Hanford, one way to look at it. And this, I sort of see this as like a barrier to entries, this map itself, which doesn't really show you anything about what is really going on at Hanford. So it's that blue line where the river flows north and then sweeps south, southeast and then straight south. This is an incredible place in the Columbia River To make plutonium for decades, what happened at Hanford is they took these nuclear fuel rods, they ran 9 reactors at Hanford, and then they took that irradiated fuel, pulled it into the center of Hanford, in this big plateau, and put it through a series of chemical processes to extract that tiny bit of plutonium. Most of everything else went into the ground, either into tanks that are dilapidated, falling apart, some of them are leaking, or straight into the ground. And hundreds of billions of gallons of contaminated groundwater has resulted. So hundreds of billions of gallons of waste went into the ground, resulting in decades of groundwater contamination. And I want to say here also that people have dedicated their lives to addressing this problem. People before me stopped Hanford from becoming a high-level waste dump. Before I was, basically as I was like a child in diapers, this was going on. So thank you to the people here in this room who have continued that work. This is how contamination moves at Hanford. I love this illustration. I'll talk a little bit more about the story map it comes from. But facilities like reactors or chemical processing facilities or underground tanks or sometimes just trenches in the ground, all of these received huge amounts of waste from making plutonium. And whatever gets into the ground at Hanford goes to the groundwater. It's inexorable. Whatever goes to the groundwater inexorably moves to the Columbia River. The only thing that stops some of this radioactivity from reaching the Columbia River is that it decays away faster than reaching the river, or the water is so voluminous that it dilutes it. Again, the technical expertise, the cultural expertise, the educators from Yakima Nation are building a new generation of people who understand these problems and are looking at it in new ways and reconnecting the tribe with the site. And you can read about this in NPR, The Guardian, AP News. All of them recently covered the work of Yakima Nation addressing Hanford. So these are some of the images from a project called Waters. I think I might have slipped a slide, did I? Oh. Yes. Waters Walk Through Hanford was an effort. This was a project written by Lisa Munoz, a member of our staff, illustrated by Trike Cheatham, and we have information on our table about how to find this. It's a story of a water drop moving through Hanford, told from the perspective of water. And you can learn a lot about the site. It has a lot of technical information, but it's also very engaging in first person. So you understand that as water moves through the Hanford site, it both interacts with contamination and moves it, but it also, at times, shields workers from the very high levels of radioactivity that exist in some of these facilities. So these incredible depictions of water and the contaminants they encounter along the way. Now we hear that Hanford might be the location for more nuclear reactors, and it causes us to ask some pretty basic questions like, okay, we talk about putting nuclear facilities at Hanford. Is it already contaminated? And is the water reaching the Columbia River? The answer is yes and yes. And the water, specifically where new reactors would be located, is contaminated. And so I'll show you a graph of that. This is an aerial photograph looking at the Columbia Generating Station. In the foreground, you see this thing marked called the 61811 site. This was part of the nuclear weapons project at Hanford, experimenting basically in the 300 area with very, very radioactive material. Some of the stuff came directly from high-level nuclear waste. Some of that stuff went into this burial ground and disposed of in ways that are not all that orderly. But this isn't really like, there are also incredibly radioactive structures where they put vertical pipes into the ground and dumped radioactive material that was so radioactive, they backed up the truck, dumped the stuff in, no one ever gets out of the truck. The truck becomes radioactive waste on its own. This stuff is very, very radioactive, and it's still there. And the reason it's still there, sorry. Oh, and this just describes a little bit, this is a screenshot, you don't have to read all this, but I just wanted to put this up because it lists so many of the radionuclides that are in this burial ground right next to the Columbia Generating Station. The reason they can't clean this up easily right now, or at all, is because it's so close to the Columbia Generating Station that excavating, exhuming this material poses a danger to the workers who work at the Columbia Generating Station. All of this Hanford cleanup work is very dangerous, and I want to appreciate the pipe fitters, the laborers, the electricians, all the folks who do the work out there, the operators who look at the tanks and make sure they're not leaking or try to. These folks are really on the front line, and I really want to appreciate the work they do. Because these are the contaminants they deal with on a daily basis. And here is this burial ground. It's directly, there we go, it's directly contributing to a tritium plume that moves beneath the Columbia Generating Station area. So on the upper left, where the big white arrow is pointing, those sort of pastel colors, which is how Department of Energy often depicts horrible radiation. Those pastel colors, actually, I think it's just so you can see it, but it's over 1 million picocuries per liter in this area. The standard is 20,000 picocuries per liter for tritium. This is for tritium. So over 59 times the drinking water standard, moving right through the area that Columbia Generating Station currently sits in, and where Energy Northwest, Puget Sound Energy, and X Energy are all talking about trying to build potentially new small modular nuclear reactors. So this is sort of a common sense problem stands out to me. And it stands out to a lot of people who would look at Hanford and realize that cleaning up this area is a tremendous challenge. Unfortunately, I'm bad at this. Unfortunately, the area near the Columbia Generating Station is not even the worst contamination at Hanford. And I'll point to just one spot along the Columbia River where pollution is really very high in reaching the Columbia River. So there's a lot going on in this slide. The Columbia River is on the left. You can see a boat going right down the middle of it. The black dot with the text box next to it, that's a well that goes into the ground. And so that is sampling groundwater. And the groundwater flows, if you could see the end reactor in kind of the bottom left, that's the first reactor that ever made power to go onto the grid at Hanford. It also made irradiated nuclear fuel that made plutonium. So that's the nexus. The end reactor is the nexus where nuclear power and nuclear weapons met at Hanford. And they've been together ever since. And that was 1962, commissioned by President Kennedy himself. That well measures over 2,000 times the drinking water standard for strontium-90. Strontium-90 is like calcium. It acts like calcium in the body, causes bone cancer. So this is within a couple hundred meters of the Columbia River. This is an astounding level of contamination when you consider that contamination stopped in this area. This is more than a half-life having passed from strontium-90, and still it's over 16,000 picocuries per liter. That's a trillionth of a curie, a picocurie. And even at that level, it's very, very dangerous.
Do you want me to do it?
Oh, I got it. We're almost there yet. And so, just to kind of wrap up, I want to take one more step back. And this is what Hanford looks like from a great distance on top of the Hanford Reach National Monument, where you can look out and you can see these white husks of former plutonium production reactors. Until those buildings are gone, Hanford cleanup is not complete. Until that groundwater is cleaned up, Hanford cleanup is not complete, and the United States is not meeting its obligation to the tribes of this region who have a right to use this place. And so until these problems are solved, putting new nuclear reactors at Hanford makes no sense. You don't have to be a technical expert. You don't have to know how to read these graphs. Speaking up for the values you care about in the Columbia River, for a future that people can imagine actually living in at Hanford, for the right of tribal people to use these places as they are guaranteed the right to do by the treaties, stopping Hanford from becoming a high-level waste dump. There's all kinds of ways to engage in this. And what I want to say here is it's also really important to recognize that many forms of knowledge, art, music, direct activism, what you are all involved in is all of these perspectives are valuable to Hanford cleanup. You don't have to know the details of every radionuclide to know that poisoning this land and this water is a tremendous harm to the people of our region. Because this stretch of the Columbia River could be clean water forever, and that is invaluable into eternity. The half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years. The Missoula floods happened 14,000 years ago. So when we think about Hanford and when we think about new nuclear projects at Hanford, those are the timelines we're struggling with. And I just really appreciate the many generations in this room and the work that you all are doing. And here are some resources at the very end. I think these slides will be shared, but I really want to encourage folks to check out this interview with Dr. Russell Jim, the late founder of the Environmental Restoration and Waste Management Program, recorded 20 years ago by the Atomic Heritage Foundation. It could have been recorded yesterday. It's the most prescient interview I can think of that describes the challenge of Hanford. So thank you all.
Are you shaken as I am? I don't even know how I can talk, but I have some things to say. Please visit the tables. You know, Brenna's table is there, Columbia River Keeper table is there, and the Oregon Conservancy Foundation table is there. There's news of films. We have a filmmaker from Atomic Bamboozle with us, Jan Hucken, and there's a film festival coming up. These are really important things that can educate us and motivate us to do things. I just want to remind you that we're going to have a Q&A session right now. I didn't mention it earlier, and I hope it wasn't too late, but there's restrooms over there. It's not too late. The Grannies, the Portland Red Jim Grannies will be presenting Nuke Reactor to the tune of My Darling Clementine after Q&A, so be sure you stick around for that. And please watch for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ's announcement of the opening of their clean air permit coming up sometime. We've been saying that for months and months, but we think it's going to happen really soon. And there will be talking points available, and we'll be hosting comment writing workshops, and so will Columbia River.
That's for
Keeper.
Zenith Energy.
Zenith Energy. What did I say?
You didn't say.
I should say Zenith Energy. Yes, for Zenith Energy. I'm just sort of shaken up from this evening's presentation. And I do want to announce that we do have 3 more rumbles in the planning right now. We have one webinar coming up on February 22nd about the Multnomah County report on the toxic fumes in the event of a Cascadia earthquake. Again, that will be coming out on the 22nd, and registration information will be coming out very soon. And we'll be at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference for Rumble number 14 on the University of Oregon campus on March 3rd in the morning there. It's a great conference if you haven't been there. And we've got plans for Rumble number 15, which will be sort of a press conference, and you'll be hearing more about that in late March or early April. And Jan keeps showing me the can there that says donations, because sometimes we have to pay for venues. We did not have to do that tonight. We're, again, very grateful to our Multnomah friends, but we do like to help our videographer. So if you can contribute something, that'd be great. We have questions, and we also have an announcements. Tomorrow, there will be a rally at 8:45. People will be gathering to urge the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners to take on the resolution for ceasefire in Gaza and that will be at the Multnomah County building, just the east side of the Hawthorne Bridge. It's right there. The rally's at 8:40 a.m. Hopefully you can come to that. And if not, the hearing starts at 9:30, and we really want to pack that place. And then on Friday, Groundhog's Day, Portland XR, which is one of our co-sponsors, will be presenting a event at 41st and Northeast Sandy. Northeast 41st. 21st. Excuse me. Northeast 21st. Get that in your brain because I screwed it up. 21st Northeast 21st and Northeast Sandy Boulevard at the KATU, which is Sinclair affiliate, will be discussing, why don't you talk about climate enough, you guys? I mean, you're on the air a lot, and this is an overriding important issue. So that's the focus of that, not just exclusively directed at KATU, because we know there's other news outlets that do not totally present enough information for us. And so, we have some Q&A, again followed by the Raging Grannies, and we hope that our panelists will be able to talk about this and pull up a mic. How would you respond if Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm was with us tonight and restated her claim that the world has to lean into getting to net zero and addressing climate change? Nuclear is such a clear part of that. I meet with counterparts from all over the world, and everywhere people are looking to us to help them reach their goals with nuclear. How would you respond to Energy Secretary Granholm?
I would respond quite simply. Substituting one form of environmental degradation for another is not the answer to addressing catastrophic climate change.
I'd probably just say I think this is the challenge, right? It's like we all know we need a transition, but it's about making sure it's an actual just transition and an actual clean transition, because there's so much greenwashing out there, beyond nuclear, of like some of these hydrogen issues, quote, renewable natural gas. And so this is where we just really have to be vigilant. So I don't know if that's what I'd say to her, but I think that's the point I wanted to make.
I think the first point I would make would be for Secretary Granholm to take a hard look at Hanford and the challenges at Hanford, and not take energy's eye off the ball when it comes to cleaning up Hanford. The Columbia River is the lifeblood of the region, and Hanford is its beating heart, right there. And Hanford contamination is a poison pill next to that heart. That will be there for millions of years unless the Department of Energy invests heavily in cleaning it up. And so taking anything away from that mission at Hanford is a huge harm to future generations.
Beyond what's already been said, I would say that, for as long as nuclear energy has been around, has been in the U.S. has used it as a tool of foreign policy domination. So really I would ask her probably first why it is that she's so comfortable being looked up to by the countries that the U.S. boot has on their necks. That's what I would ask. Really, why? And also would ask, NuScale, these SMR technologies, they are too expensive for the American people. The American people don't even want it. So it seems like she doesn't even know what the American people want. Why would she know what the people of other countries want?
Next question. And what can individuals do to stop the expansion of nuclear energy in the U.S.?
When we start down to that end.
Yeah. Good question. Take action. Get mobilized. Talk to each other. Join an organization. The issue of energy affects us all because it's a basic need for everybody. And we can only really do so much individually, but collectively, truly, we can make change because power belongs to the people.
That's right.
That's right.
Yep.
Thank you. I strongly agree. And I would say that listening to the voices of the people who are most impacted.
Louder.
I would say that listening to the voices of the people who are most impacted by radiation, by nuclear waste already, and by nuclear power already, that can be very instructive to understanding how you actually balance your energy decisions, because the burden of suffering is highly disproportionate and falling on Indigenous people, and that is true, very true for Hanford. And so empowering, uplifting those voices is really important. I think we can all do.
Oh, actually, there's one here. 3 words: educate, activate, organize. That's basically what it comes down to. And this room is full of information. Again, I want to invite you to make yourself accessible to all of it and pass it on. Not only educate yourself, but educate others. And activate. All these various groups that are involved here are activating. Get involved. And get involved especially in stopping what's happening in both the Oregon and Washington legislature. And finally, organize, which is exactly what we're doing. Thank you.
Bonnie, question over here.
Okay, I'm gonna do these
Okay.
first. Okay. This one came from Peter Burgell. If nuclear power continues the way it is going now, project cancellations due to huge cost overruns and constant delays, private capital will eventually refuse to continue its involvement because there will be no way to profit. However, the government really wants nuclear power because of its connection to nuclear weapons. So is it not possible that the end result will be that the government will nationalize the entire industry without concern about the cost, and taxpayers will be forced to own it? And if that is the industry's future direction, how can we prevent it?
This question really answers the question that Brenna asked. Why is this happening to the Philippines? Think about it. This country is the #1 arms merchant in the world, right? And what's behind that? The military-industrial complex. Why are we surprised if the nuclear industry, which is also the nuclear industrial complex, is trying to push its product throughout the world? That's what we are confronting here. That's what we need to oppose. And, you know, I'm not concerned about the national takeover. I think that's already happened. That's where we're at right now. This is the government's business. The industries are kind of up front for it. And they all work together to try and make it happen.
I mean, the corporations and the government working hand in hand, isn't that fascism? Yeah, I mean, we're living in a light version of that. I don't see this coming to pass, but I do think there are a lot of people who think that they're gonna make a lot of money off of nuclear, and they're gonna make it off of the government subsidies. So I think that's where, you know, we need to stop it before it gets through this scenario that Peter's describing. I think we can stop that.
Just absolutely echo Lloyd and Kelly.
Are you gonna echo too, Dan? Okay, and then we'll get that question, but I'm gonna give this final question.
We're getting there.
And we are gonna carry the question and answer too long, because we really want. We really want you to have a chance to visit those tables that you might have missed before we began, and see if there's any snacks left. So we do not have a close time. To recap, what do each of you think are the most effective and publicly acceptable arguments against the notion that nuclear energy is a climate solution?
Let's start on that.
I think we've really hit on it, hopefully, tonight. But I would say, you know, beyond the risks of war that are very obvious when it comes to nuclear power, beyond the very real situation of the contamination that exists when it comes to nuclear power. Really, I think it's that nuclear energy operates on the same logic ultimately as fossil fuels, meaning that the way nuclear energy exists is that it is bought for, paid for by big corporations for profit, not to actually provide what the people need, right? I mean, that's how you have all of this public research funded at OSU and by the DOE, and somehow all of these giant corporations are profiting off it as well. And in the meantime, your energy bill just keeps going up and up and up, right? Because it's all for profit. That is what is happening with fossil fuels, and that is what would happen with nuclear energy as well, right? Until that system actually changes, it will not be different.
I strongly agree with what Brenna said, and I think one of the ways we can think about the burden of it is the climate is changing, the people will need clean water, and the people at Hanford, the tribal people who've been at Hanford forever, will be there. And so what will they experience in that changed climate? Will it be water that's poisoned or water that's not poisoned? And so community needs have to be the center of how we approach climate justice. And as Brenda said, the nuclear industry is more of the same, and it is unfathomably poorly suited for the Columbia River.
I come back to that just transition slide that I showed. I think just having a framework for understanding, people are scared, right? People are scared of climate change. It's urgent. We need to act now. We need to do everything to do it. But we don't need to do everything, because if we do everything, we do dumb things like nuclear. We need to be smart about it, and we need to, use it as a moment to really change the paradigm of, coming from this extractive economy into a regenerative economy, and really painting a picture of what that looks like and what's part of that. And that helps us understand what's in and what's out, right? And clearly, as we talked about tonight, there's no room for nuclear in that regenerative economy.
Right. Thankfully, this gives me an opportunity to address something that I mistakenly left out of my slide presentation. And I think that it really does make a good point about how small modular nuclear proponents are saying that events like that happen at Trojan and other nuclear plants around the world are not going to happen to them because of their assembly line modular construction. And the only point that I say in response to that, which I think is terribly important, is you should keep in mind the news of the failure in Boeing's assembly line construction of Boeing 737 MAX 9's airplane. It will happen to small modular nuclear reactors as well. And why? Because they operate to make a profit, and they're going to cut as much as they can out safety considerations in order to make that profit. That's why we shouldn't rely on this for climate, to address the problems of climate change. We have much better solutions.
Okay, that extra question.
So when we look at the grid, a lot of the power is in a thing called base load. We all want to get rid of fossil fuels. When we do that, there is a huge gap on base load to fill. There are 4 ways to do base load, to my understanding: fossil fuel generation, including oil and coal, hydro, nuclear, and batteries. So if we take out all the fossil fuels, hydro is tapped out. We've got as much from hydro as we're going to get. How do you propose that we fill the gap in base load without nuclear?
So I'll start. I think that, you know, the more that I'm reading about baseload, like, it's a myth that we actually need that, and it's a myth that nuclear provides that. There are a lot of times when the Columbia Generating Station has been shut down for months more than it was supposed to be. There's a lot of times when, you know, nuclear doesn't provide a consistent, and, you know, there's so many new technologies coming online now of different types of batteries and different types of storage, that, you know, there's a lot of research that shows, like, we don't need, baseload is like an antiquated idea, that there are ways that we can improve the grid, and there are ways that we can store energy, and that we can, you know, do it in a different way. Again, we're not going to try to just remodel what did we do with fossil fuels and do it again. It's about a different modeling system, and I've seen some encouraging, you know, studies out there that show, you know, that baseload is really an antiquated idea.
I want to share with you, I like quotes, and I have a whole bunch of them. And I want to share with you one quote from a man by the name of Arnie Gunderson. He's a former utility executive and a nuclear engineer with 44 years of experience. And here's what he had to say. We all know that the wind doesn't blow consistently and the sun doesn't shine every day. But the nuclear industry would have you believe that humankind is smart enough to develop techniques to store nuclear waste for 250,000 years. But at the same time, humankind is so dumb, we can't figure out a way to store electricity overnight. To me, that doesn't make sense.
Kelly Lloyd.
Another question.
Given that the process of mining, wasting water, and transporting the uranium, etc., and then making the concrete, we've already reached peak concrete in the world, wasting all the water in the process, we don't have the water to keep things cool and clean. We're going to be using up more greenhouse gases for producing this, and we're going to be losing the climate adjustment and remediation from the water that we're destroying and the land that we're destroying. How can you tell people again that the net, even forget about danger to human beings and tribal rights and democracy and war, but just that it uses up more greenhouse gases?
I agree. Everybody's got it. I think we're all in agreement. I think your point is very well made.
Yeah, just to add on to that very briefly, talking about the Philippines has no natural uranium reserves. So just imagine how much energy is going to be spent to bring that uranium all the way to the Philippines, right? It's, yeah, exactly that. It's wasting so much energy.
So we have another question. How about you?
Sure.
This is Chuck Johnson, by the way. Remember the 1980 ballot question.
I just wanted to ask if there's been any discussion. I know that Earl Blumenauer has been a big supporter of small modular reactors and of the NuScale proposal specifically. He's no longer going to be congressman in this district anymore after this year, and there's a race to see who will succeed him. I have the sense at this point that Senator Merkley understands that there's a problem with this particular proposal, but he hasn't had the courage to really speak out forthrightly on this. We need someone in Oregon to speak out forthrightly, and I'm wondering if groups here are thinking about talking to these congressional candidates in this district about taking a stand against nuclear power and saying, we're wasting time, we are wasting money, we don't have time, we don't have money. This is a crisis, and we can't just keep feeding this ridiculous concept that nuclear power is going to bail us out.
Chuck, it's on my to-do list. If anyone's already talked to those candidates.
We need to go.
We have a petition, and there are other petitions here too. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. We do need a champion from our congressional delegation to start asking tough questions.
There's no one in our congressional delegation that I'm aware of that's not pro small modular nuclear reactors. It's most unfortunate. I think I would like to encourage Chuck to run for Congress.
Sorry, just to add one more thing to that. I totally agree with you, and I think with this NuScale debacle, like, it's a time to go back to some of them, like Jeff Merkley, that's maybe a little more amenable, and again, with the new candidates, you know, running to replace Blumenauer, that, like, we have a different argument, because all these folks hear from NuScale all the time, is the sense I get. They're hearing from them all the time. It's a local Oregon company, so of course they have to support a local Oregon company, but now, you know, things have changed in the past few months with NuScale's situation, and so I think it's time that they hear from us about that.
I totally agree. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think it is something that we should all be talking about and figuring out, because Kelly, you're right, we need to start putting pressure on the people who are actually making these policies. But I think let's figure it out together.
Yes.
And remember, on the back of your program is the contact list. People.
The question about NuScale basically not being able to meet any of their promises and basically practically only going out of business reminds me of Kinder Morgan in Canada, who owned a pipeline that now is owned by the people of British Columbia. And so that's one scary model, and I wonder how, when it's so clear that nuclear power is just a boondoggle, as this movie mentions, and that it doesn't pencil out at all of how to get elected officials, not to mention the rest of us, on board to really recognize what bullshit it is and to really move on.
All right, I think we're all in support.
Let's do it. I think we are at an end here. And, but we do want to have the grannies come on up.
Since the grannies believe that music is yet another avenue to make an impact on others, we wrote this hoping that singing some of the information to you will put it into your brain and you'll take it home in yet another different way.
And some of the grannies didn't know what this word Dine in the first verse means. Dine is the name Navajo people call themselves. If you're not aware of what happened to the Navajo Dine uranium miners for 20 years, just Google it. Wikipedia has a really great article about it.
All right, and please sing along. It really is a tune that you should.
We all know, oh my darling, oh my darling.
Nuke reactors, oh, they're evils we have seen, but the people who promote them say their energy is clean. In the hills of the Four Corners, where they dug uranium ore, DNA miners and their families died of cancer by the score. Love Canal and Fukushima and Chernobyl were not flukes. They're examples why we should not get our energy from nukes. Nuke reactors, oh, they're evils we have seen, but the people who promote them say their energy is clean. Not to mention waste disposal is a problem of its own. Hidden deep within our mountains, radiation finds a home. There it sits and leaks forever while we live in ignorance. Future generations curse us, poisoned by our energy is clean, for the water